Well, good morning. How are you today?
Good.
Yeah, so you're still up in California, I assume?
Yes, same place, just north of San Francisco.
Yeah, so I haven't talked to you in about, I guess it's been about 3 years since we last chatted. So,
Yep.
so why don't you do this if you don't mind, because some of the people may not be familiar with your background. Just share a little bit of your background of who you are, and then we can chat a little bit.
Okay. So I live and work on a ranch in north of San Francisco here in California, and I was a vegetarian for 33 years, but no longer am. So that's a kind of an interesting shift since the last time we spoke. But my background is as an environmental lawyer and now a rancher, and I've written two books about meat production, and the latest book is called Defending Beef, and there's a new version of the book coming out in July. So I'm kind of a and my undergraduate degree is in biology, so I have kind of a scientific background. That's our goose. I may close the window here. Hold on. He's a little noisy in the morning sometimes. So you can see it's a real farm. So I'm kind of have a scientific background and a legal background, and then an environmental advocacy background, and then a ranching background. So I have those are kind of the four main pieces.
Yeah, so I was wondering, because I remember the last time I talked to you, you were considering departing from vegetarianism. I remember you were like on the edge, and that was a couple of years ago. And so, hopefully it's working out for you in a better way.
Yeah,
And background, obviously,
great.
it kind of makes you unique. You have some kind of a unique insight perspective on probably what we eat and how we eat and why we eat stuff in the food production industry. And so tell me, I guess I'd ask you, so what made you feel a need to update the Defending Beef book? Was there some new information that you wanted to get out there? And if so, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it was both. It was primarily a desire to include a lot of the new research that's been coming out with respect to both the dietary side and the environmental side of the argument that I make in the book. And especially because this whole idea of carbon sequestration, and there's a lot more attention to that now. There's been a lot more research focusing on that in the soils, particularly. And then there's a lot more thorough discussion of methane that's been available and a lot of more research that's been done on methane. And I really expanded the methane argument in the new book, because I always knew this was a concern that people had. So I talked about it in the original version. But at that time, there wasn't that much scientific research into the topic. And there's been a lot done in the last 5 years. So I added a lot and explained a lot more. I learned a lot as well, additionally, about methane and how to understand it. So I updated the methane argument related to climate change in particular, and that because there's so much attention around cattle and methane, and I've met so many people who will actually say I don't eat beef because of methane. I mean, it's like it's like this really oversimplified argument that I hear all the time. So I did a lot more on that, and then I added a lot of the new studies about red meat being not being harmful and actually being important, especially for people as they age. So those are kind of the meatiest chunks of what I changed about the book. But I also shifted my own perspective somewhat, because as every year my thinking is evolving on this. And there's a lot more emphasis on the danger of processed foods and the value of meat as kind of a real, whole, nutrient-rich food, as opposed to the things that people start eating when they reduce meat. For example, the faux meat burgers that are, I mean, I think it's so ironic that there's so much public health and medical, quote unquote, medical information coming out telling people to eat that kind of food, because it's, to me, clearer and clearer that processed foods are really problematic. And when people are abandoning meat and choosing a processed food to replace it, that's exactly, to me, the worst kind of shift you could make in your diet. So I talk more about that issue as well in the new book.
Yeah, and that's what always seems to happen. I mean, you take this natural whole food that we've been eating for, since the dawn of mankind, and we replace it with something. And it isn't, you know, it's not like people are going to stop eating meat and they're going to start suddenly all eating beans and lentils. I mean, it's not going to happen that way. I mean, and the food industry knows this. I mean, they're going to go and adopt some sort of, you know, highly processed alternative. You know, we saw like butter for margarine, you know, and then we're going to see meat for fake meat. And that's, I mean, all that does is bolster the you know, the shareholders and CEOs profit margins at these companies, because they get these really highly processed, highly profitable, cheap foods with cheap ingredients,
right,
and sort of greenwash it and health wash it and convince you it's better for you when we all know it's not. I mean, you'd have to be, I don't know. I mean, I guess the marketing is so good, people fall for it. I mean, we see how powerful it is. But let me ask you about that. You know, so you know, obviously there's more people talking about soil. I don't know how many people are talking about soil. I talk about it all the time. The people I talk to talk about it all the time. But how much is being talked about in the sort of the larger, you know, discussion? You know, because we see so much, again, so much marketing dollars and airtime, you know, for this. Eat meats, you know, stop eating meat, save the planet.
yeah,
You know, the biggest thing you can do, the most impactful thing you can possibly do to save the world is to stop eating beef or something like that, which is nonsense. But what sort of new information has come out about in the last, you know, 5 years or so? I can't remember when you wrote the book, but it's more about 5 years at least or something like that. What are the major, I mean, I know you talk about, but let's talk a little bit more specifically. What do you mean by new methane data, new soil data, new health data? What specifically are you pointing to?
Well, on the carbon sequestration side, there have been a number of new studies, but I think two of the most notable are kind of a smaller study that was done on the White Oak Pastures farm in Georgia. And it was done by an independent third party that was just sort of doing an environmental audit of their ranch, or their farm, I should say. And it's a diversified farm that has, and you've probably had Will Harris on here before, I'm imagining. You're probably moving in the same circles as Will Harris, but you know, the person who owns and operates the White Oak Pastures farm, which I've had a chance to visit down in Bluffton, Georgia, and it's a beautiful place. And what Will Harris has done is he took, you know, a farm that had been in his family for a long time and was basically being conventionally farmed. And then he's turned it into this very diverse operation, not just diverse agriculturally, but diverse sort of economically. They have all these different streams of commerce. They've created products like soaps and candles and things using, you know, the animal products that they have from their animals that they sell for meat. So it's a really neat example of what you can do with creativity for, you know, in agriculture to create healthy food and support your economy and all this stuff. It's a pretty amazing place. But what they did was this independent auditor kind of looked at all these different things they were producing on their farm, and they found that there was kind of a carbon footprint. There was a certain amount of carbon emissions that had to be attributed to each of these commerce streams, except for the beef. The beef was the only thing on the farm that actually had a carbon not just neutral, but negative footprint, because it actually, the total footprint, when they looked at all of the inputs and all of the outputs and, you know, sort of what it was, you know, the kind of supposed, you know, ecological footprint of that product, they actually found that the beef sequestered more carbon in the soil than the total emissions. And that includes the methane emissions. They included all of the greenhouse gas emissions and, you know, all of the whole stream of commerce for the beef. So that was a really interesting, it was a small scale, you know, study, because it's looking at one operation, but it was very eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people, because first of all, people are never talking about the carbon footprint of any other foods. They only talk about beef. So I thought one of the important things about that analysis was showing that there's kind of a, you know, there's a certain amount of emissions from every kind of food that's produced. And when you know, depending on how you're doing it, you can have more or less emissions on every food that's produced. But what you can do with beef is you can actually get into the carbon negative territory, which is almost impossible with other kinds of foods. And that's mostly because of the fact that grazing actually, first of all, you don't have to plow when you're grazing. When you're, and so beef cattle can actually use land entirely that is from unplowed. You know, they're grazing on undisturbed natural vegetation, pasture, rangeland, lots of different forms it can take. But when you do the plowing, it causes a lot of the emissions because you're basically allowing the soil to be exposed, and there's a lot of release of emissions. And also you're damaging the vegetation. You're sort of ripping apart all the vegetative cover that protects the soil. And also all of the root systems that are beneath the soil is precisely what holds the water and holds all of the biological life together. There's kind of this whole underground ecosystem that is basically based on the root systems. So whenever you do plowing and you have bare dirt, you lose a tremendous amount of the carbon that you're trying to keep in the soil. And you also lose a lot of the moisture for the whole ecosystem, because you're basically breaking apart all of those wonderful water channels that are created by the vegetative cover. And the vegetative cover is maintained by the grazing. So, and there's also really good research showing that the action of the animals, the sort of animal impact, their pruning of the vegetation with their mouths, they add soil moisture to the soil with their urine and their feces. So there's kind of this whole impact that the animal has, the animal's bodily functions have on the health of that whole system. And so you can do as the the white oak pastures example shows, you can do farming where you're actually improving the soil and improving the whole health of the ecosystem with grazing. That's a lot harder to do with crop production, whether it's strawberries or green beans or rice or corn, you know what I mean? Whatever it is, it's much harder to do that. You can do no-till farming, and there are ways you can reduce the impact, but you can't have that same kind of beneficial effect. So that white oak pastures study was a really neat example of how you can have a greenhouse gas positive impact with beef, and you really can't do it with other foods. Now, the other major study that was done, I mean, that was kind of a small scale study. The one that was done over a longer term and more scientifically and with a larger number of animals and so forth, it was done by Michigan State University, based in East Lansing, Michigan. And they just they took beef that was totally grass fed, and then they also took grain finished beef, and they just compared, they looked at all of the all of the inputs going into it again, and then looked at the outputs. And this was done, very carefully and methodically, and measuring, the carbon in the soil on the land over time. And they found that where they had totally grass finished beef, the system that used that method, they were able to have basically carbon neutral beef production. And they found, again, because you added so much additional carbon and biological life to the soil with the grazing, that had a totally, it kind of wiped out the emissions that were caused in the production. And this was an interesting study because it was comparing it to grain finishing as well. And it found that grain finishing, because sometimes there are some studies that have been funded by the beef industry that have shown that grain finished beef is better from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. And this study really countered that and said, no, that's not accurate. So it, because basically there's a whole push within the meat industry to make the whole industry more concentrated, have more feedlots, and have more intensification basically. And this study looked a lot more carefully at all the inputs and the outputs and said, no, that's not accurate. So that was an important study, but it was also important because it showed basically carbon neutrality for well-managed grass-fed beef.
Was that Jason Roundtree? Was he on that? I think.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I've interviewed both Will Harris and Jason Roundtree, and gosh, probably most people you probably would refer to. Honestly, it's been a fun time. You mentioned methane, and so obviously cows have been excreting methane through belching and through their manure for millennia, realistically, and we've never had issues with greenhouse gas issues, despite the fact that we've had ruminant animals on the planet for millions and millions of years. What is new in the methane world? I mean, what I see is there are just more and more sources they're finding everywhere, and the fact that the cycle is a short cycle, and it's a part of a natural cycle. But I'm interested to hear your take on what's going on with methane.
Yeah, the methane thing is really interesting. I mean, even just in the last couple of weeks, so this doesn't make it into my book because this is very new, but this is just right in line with what I write about in the book. They're identifying more and more sources of industrial methane that hadn't been counted. So for example, in natural gas production, there are all kinds of leaks that happen in those systems. And I just recently, this was an article I saw last week, there was, for the first time, there was an effort in Europe to measure the leaks from the natural gas production and oil industry in Europe. And I don't even know exactly where the major geographically, you know, where that's concentrated in Europe, but it was in Europe. And it was saying that there was so much methane coming from that it completely should shift all of the estimates that, you know, what the sources were in Europe as methane. And it was such a large amount, you know, that it was like dramatically more than what has ever even been attributed to cattle. But this is something, the article pointed out, it was something that nobody was measuring up until this recent event, and they also don't regulate it. So, and that's pretty much the same situation in the United States. And the argument I present in Defending Beef is mostly focused on the US as far as methane leaks. But there's a ton of good science that's been done showing that there are a lot of methane leaks all throughout the sort of the fossil fuel industry, basically. And those are not being really capped or controlled, and they're not even really being measured. And so in the book, I show, and I talk specifically about Dr. Robert Howarth, who's based at Cornell University, and he leads something called the Methane Project. And he's done a lot of stuff showing that even the studies that purported to show that cattle were causing a lot of the methane in the United States were actually not correct, because he's looked much more carefully at the satellite data showing where methane is coming from. And he says it really does not correspond with cattle populations at all. And that actually what he believes the primary source of is fracking. And he's done a lot of research showing that. And then there's this whole other aspect to methane. So for one thing, we don't really even know right now where methane is coming from. And we're increasingly discovering that the methane that is out there wasn't being properly measured or attributed to the right sources. So the methane, it's kind of like people think it's very straightforward. It's actually not straightforward at all. We barely know how to track it, you know, or how to measure it. And the other really interesting part about the methane thing, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff to say about methane, about mitigation, and a lot of stuff that's being done in the cattle industry to mitigate methane, and I can talk about that as well. But just even before you get to that part of it, there's also a whole nother aspect to methane, which is just how we talk about it in public policy terms. Because, and I had a chance to meet this person in England a couple of years ago. There's a professor by the name of Dr. Miles Allen, who's at Oxford University. He's a physicist. He's a methane expert. He was actually on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. He was on their scientific advisory committee for several years. And so he's like literally one of the world's leading experts in methane and how you should treat it in public policy. And I saw some videos of him speaking about this, and I read some articles that he wrote. And then I got a chance to meet him in person in England a couple of years ago and talk to him directly. And basically what he had told me and what I saw in his videos is that a number of years ago, to make things simpler for public policy purposes, you know, for laws and regulations and statutes around the world, they started to essentially make carbon, you know, CO2 and the carbon and methane equivalent. And they created this little very simple mathematical formula saying this much methane, you know, equals this much carbon dioxide. But what he has basically argued is that that's essentially nonsense, because in the real world, carbon dioxide and methane behave totally differently. And so there's this thing called global warming potential, GWP, and they use that in all of the, you know, everything coming out of the United Nations and so forth uses this idea, and it just equates this certain amount of methane with a certain amount of CO2, and it says essentially treats them as equal, except for, you know, it gives methane a higher number because it's, you know, has a higher impact. But he says this is total nonsense because in the real world, methane has a very short life. It's basically oxidized and it breaks down very quickly. There's a hydrolysis process that happens to it, and it's basically becomes benign after fewer than 10 years typically, which sounds like a long time, but in sort of global warming terms, it's very short. Whereas CO2 has a half-life of over 100,000 years. And so it actually has an impact that's essentially permanent. So when you have CO2 emissions, it kind of stockpiles in the atmosphere, and it's called a stock gas because of that reason. It just keeps building up more and more of it. Methane, on the other hand, kind of breaks down quickly and kind of cycles back into the environment. And what Miles Allen says is that basically everybody knows this in the scientific world, but because of the fact that this measure was come up with, a couple of decades ago, somebody invented this equating methane and CO2, and because they did that, as he told me, everybody knows that it's scientifically invalid, but the implications from a policy standpoint of changing it would be huge. And so nobody wants to do it because it's too much work to undo it. But he's created something called the GWP asterisk, okay? And this measurement actually takes into account the real world impact of methane. And I give an example in my book, and I show how if you had a rising population of cattle worldwide, it would have some impact on global warming. If you had a stable stable cattle population worldwide, though, it would have no impact. And so that's what's really interesting, because the way the sort of world, UN, the United Nations and others treats the cattle herd of the world, they treat it as having this huge global warming impact. But he says that's actually not true at all. They're not affecting the warming, okay? There's a historical load of methane, and they're simply maintaining it by existing. So it's a very interesting point that utterly changes the way we should be thinking about and talking about methane. And in the US, actually, the methane, as I mentioned before, there's all kinds of other sources that are, that haven't been properly measured and that are probably causing a lot more methane than we previously understood. But there's been a dramatic drop in methane levels in the United States for the last couple of decades. So this attention to methane, especially when you're talking to Americans, is kind of absurd. It's really a red herring. So that's kind of the main, those are the main points of it, but I go through it in even more detail in the book. And the other end of the methane issue is that there's really good research being done around the world on mitigating methane from cattle, in terms of, for example, adding a little bit of seaweed to feed has been shown to do as much as 90 or even 99%. Some studies, they're a little bit over, around there's like 70% on one end of the spectrum and 99% on another end. But that's one approach that could be used to dramatically reduce methane from the cattle herd if we needed to go that route. But I'm not even sure we need to do that because of everything I was just talking about. I think it's actually, it's really something that has been, it's almost a manufactured controversy is the way I see it.
Yeah, but that manufactured controversy is getting a lot of traction. There's a lot of people that believe that and are willing to, give up meat to save the planet based on this stuff. I've seen like NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory studies on atmospheric methane was actually up there in the atmosphere versus what they think is being emitted from the ground. And there's not really much concordance. I mean, it's like, people on the ground think that cattle are producing 50% of our greenhouse gases, based on like World Resource Institute, which is ridiculous. And then when they go and actually sample the atmosphere looking at isotopic data, they say that's not where it's coming from. We're finding it from, like you mentioned, energy sector basically, and rice paddies and places, and wetlands being a huge one. I know they discovered huge amounts of methane in China recently. Surprise, surprise,
yeah, well, and there's, and that study you just mentioned, the World Resources Institute, that thing in and of itself was absurd. I talked about that in quite a bit of detail in my book as well, because it's kind of the origin of a lot of people's understanding of the issue. And essentially, that was an article that was written by a couple of environmental policy analysts, one of whom was a very active vegan advocate, a guy, Robert Goodland. And basically they were trying to make the argument that against cattle based on their own, personal biases that people shouldn't be eating meat, for other reasons. And that's actually really true. Like that whole movie Cowspiracy, which was based on that figure, it's almost always when you go back to the origin of these anti-meat movies and even purportedly environmental reports, very often you find that the people who are instigating these projects are people who, from a philosophical standpoint, from an animal rights perspective, think we should not be eating meat. And what they're doing is they're using the environmental argument to make that case. And I even, in defending beef, I even talk about how there's such interesting history on some of this stuff. If you go back and look at, like a few decades ago, the main argument, was meat is murder, right? And that didn't have that much resonance with people. And so there was a very deliberate and conscious decision within the animal rights community to shift that message. And I even came across a video on YouTube by Jeremy Rifkin, who wrote the book Beyond Beef, who's a well-known journalist and whose wife was always a vegan. And I think he's now a vegan himself too, although he wasn't when he wrote the book. But he was giving a lecture at the Harvard University Animal Rights Law Conference. And, it's right there for anyone to look at. He says, essentially, we got to use this climate change issue because the meat is murder thing hasn't really worked. I mean, I'm not sure if he says it in exactly those words, but that's what he basically says. We've kind of reached a plateau. We're not converting more people to veganism. So now we got to adopt other arguments. And the best one we've got is climate change. And I was just stunned when I saw this video because I knew this was going on for a long, long time. But to see it explicitly spelled out was pretty amazing. So this was a very deliberate, constructed argument that, originated from an animal rights perspective. That's just plain and simple. That's how it is.
Yeah, and the fact that, and their messaging, I think the biggest thing is now they've got Silicon Valley and the investors in the foam meats pumping all that money in because they smell an opportunity to create a, 100, 200, 300, $400 billion market. And I think that's what we're seeing all this. I don't think they could care less about vegans and vegan ethics and animal welfare and that type of stuff. I think it's purely money driven. Speaking of, as a vegetarian, I'm not sure, I can't remember your reasons for becoming vegetarian, if it had to do with health or animal ethics or all of the above, but what are your thoughts as a rancher right now? And I talk to ranchers all the time. My understanding, ranchers, they profoundly care about the welfare of their animals, and there's a difference between animal welfare and animal rights. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah,
maybe you can address as someone who's been on maybe perhaps both sides of the issue. What have you come to conclude?
Well, I have to say, and I talk about this in my books as well. I was never one of those people who ever bought the ethical argument against eating animals because for me, I'm very biologically based. Like I said, I was a biology major in college and I was raised by, my father was a history professor and he just loved walking out in natural areas. And I used to go with him almost daily out in this big natural area by our home. And we used to just sort of talk about everything, the world and the shape of the world and what we were seeing and what we were surrounded by. And my whole perspective is basically that there's a lot of wisdom in nature and that if you pay attention to and learn from nature, you learn a lot about how to be healthy and how to be in balance. And I think that a lot of that comes from my father, that perspective. And so it just never made sense to me that a food that we were eating, as you say, for millions of years, whether it's eggs or meat, probably milk, milk's a little more recent addition to the human diet, but there were animal-based foods, fish and, eggs and meat for, millions of years. So to me, being someone who just, studied evolution for all those years and understands the whole world from that natural-based perspective, it never made sense to argue or to think that there was something wrong with eating meat or eggs or fish or anything like that. That being said, what, when I was in college, and as a biology major, as an active environmentalist, I was exposed to a lot of the, meat is killing the planet stuff. And I remember particularly like as a freshman in college, actually seeing like brochures and stuff from the Sierra Club and others saying essentially that beef was causing the deforestation in the rainforest and, in the Amazon. And so that was a big factor in my decision. And also there was this whole idea that meat was unhealthy. And, this was in the 1980s. And that was really when that idea was really taking hold, especially the concern about saturated fats and all this stuff. And so it just kind of made sense to me that, well, I guess, I should not be eating meat. And then I've always been an animal lover. So it was sort of like a nice comforting idea, like, well, I don't have to kill animals to live kind of thing. And what happened was, as an environmental lawyer, I was given the task by Bobby Kennedy Jr. at Waterkeeper in the year 2000. So that's 21 years ago now. Seems, time flies. I can't believe it was that long ago. But anyway, I was given the task to, to work exclusively on the issue of meat production and the environmental problems associated with that. But we were totally focused on the sort of large concentrated operations, basically what I would call industrial operations, and in particular in poultry and pigs and dairy. And even then I really realized that, the sort of the grazing animals, the beef cattle, which is why it's always been ironic to me that there's been so much negative attention to pay to it, because I, even back as a, full-fledged vegetarian and environmental lawyer, I always viewed the beef as the least problematic in the food system. But it was really my work at Waterkeeper in those 2 years that I was working full-time on meat-related issues that it started shifting my perspective about whether or not I favored, having animals in the food system, because I saw such a dramatic difference depending on how they were raised in terms of everything, the environmental impact, the quality of life for the animals, the quality of life for the humans. And so for me, the animal welfare issue, as you said, has always been really important. And that's how the animals are treated and what is their daily experience in their lives. And then what is their experience at slaughter and so forth. That's always been really important to me, and it still is. But the idea that it's wrong ethically to eat them at all or to raise them for food was something that never made sense to me. And so I see the ethical issue in food production really differently. To me, it's about, especially when you're dealing with animals, it's really about how much respect and care is being taken in this process. And are you giving an animal essentially a life that's worth living? And if you are, and if you're, upholding your obligation to give that animal, a good life and a swift and painless death, I think you have fully upheld your ethical obligation as a human to the animals. And, I also think that every kind of farming, again, whether you're talking about fruit or vegetable, we have obligations to take care of all of what we're impacting, whether it's the water or the soils or the air or wildlife. And all kinds of agriculture have a lot of impacts on all of those things. So it's again, it's kind of strange to me when people talk about the ethics of farming and they're just focusing on whether you're eating animals or not. To me, that's not even really the ethical. That's not the crux of the matter at all. And I'm much more concerned about this whole holistic vision of being good stewards of everything that we're affecting in agriculture.
Yeah, I think your point of, raising food, regardless if it's plant or animal food, you're still you can still do it a way that is, environmentally beneficial and I guess respectful, and you can do it in a way in a very, very destructive way. And I'm sure you're aware that all crop production results in some death of animals. I mean, in some cases, it's quite,
yes.
It always sort of boggles my mind that someone could say I'm having a guilt-free vegan salad or whatever they're saying. And I'm like,
right.
well, you realize that, literally thousands, if not millions of animals die to produce that crop, whether it's through pesticide use or farmers out there paying people to shoot animals because they do. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so there's no such thing as a, death-free meal. I mean, I guess you go out in a tree and
right.
pick your own fruit, maybe you might argue that, but I mean, it's not what almost anyone really does or can do anymore. So what are your, I mean, so you're a rancher, and I guess you're raising, I'm assuming you're raising cattle. I mean, what do you try to do with your animals? I mean, you mentioned you want to do the best thing, but what does it look like for you and how many animals do you raise and what kinds and what sort of processes do you use?
Yeah, we have cattle, and they're totally grass. Their whole lives are spent on grass. We also have outdoor raised turkeys. Normally, they're not here right at this moment because we're shifting the way we're doing things a little bit. But normally, we also have an outdoor raised turkey flock. And what's really important to us is kind of starting from the beginning, like the genetics of the animal. Raising an animal that can kind of function in a healthy way on a daily basis without having much human intervention, or doesn't need any assistance. So we start right from the beginning. We want an animal that can give unassisted birth. Okay, this is something you don't hear too much discussion of in the mainstream conversation about meat, but it's a really important point. We want our animals to be kind of like healthy, like almost like they were wild animals, and they can give birth. They mate naturally, and they can give birth without human assistance and survive that. And then the young are reared by their mothers to a certain age, an average of 7 to 9 months. And then they're weaned from their mothers, but they are always living in a herd. They're always together with other animals, and they're outdoors grazing. So a lot of our sort of attention to what we're doing as far as how we're raising our animals is that essentially we want to have an animal right from the start that is a healthy animal and that doesn't require any kind of medications or chemicals to be healthy. And of course, as just a very fundamental baseline thing, we don't give any of our animals growth hormones or anything like that. We do believe, though, again, talking about the animal welfare, we do not believe in a complete ban on antibiotics, because there's a lot of times when you have an animal that would tremendously benefit, a sick animal. I mean, fortunately, it doesn't actually come up very often. It's just a couple times a year. But if you have a sick individual animal that needs an antibiotic, just like I don't give my kids very much medication at all, but if they need it, I give it to them. So each of them have had antibiotics. I think once, or I think one of them has had it twice. One of them's had it once in their lives. So we try to not use it unless it's necessary. We do the same thing with our cattle. Basically, if for example, we had a cow, maybe it was about 10 years ago now, who was a really good female, healthy, but she got pneumonia at a certain time of year. There's a certain time of year when the weather is shifting that the cattle are more prone to getting pneumonia, and she got pneumonia, and we gave her antibiotics, and it probably saved her life. And she continued on in the herd for many years after that as a healthy and productive member of the herd. So we do believe in using antibiotics, but only therapeutically and in a very measured and controlled way. And that's really the only form of sort of therapy, any kind of pharmaceutical rather, that we give to our animals. And essentially they're just raised on grass. Their entire life is spent here, and they're rotated onto new pasture regularly, or rangeland is basically a better characterization of most of the land that we graze. And then we slaughter them at a nearby facility, and someone from our ranch is always present at the slaughter to ensure that for the whole time, to make sure that they're handled properly at slaughter. That's another important aspect of it. You can raise an animal really well for a couple of years and take it to a slaughterhouse, and if they mistreat the animal, that's not just bad for the animal, it actually affects the meat quality. So you really don't want that to happen. So we believe, and we always encourage all the ranchers that we're working with to that they should be physically present at any time when an animal is being slaughtered. So we just kind of make sure, our goal is to have the animal live essentially as natural a life as possible. And we think that produces not just the healthiest animals, but the best tasting and most nutritious meat as well. So those are kind of the basics.
Yeah, I mean, on your point about antibiotics, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think legislation, I think around 2017 or something, where they just kind of pretty much banned this routine use of antibiotics anyway. I mean, it's something that I think maybe I'm incorrect.
There's been some state legislation doing that,
Okay.
like in California, but that's not national legislation. I mean, I actually think that is a good idea. We should have that kind of legislation because most of the antibiotics that are being used in the food system right now are being used essentially prophylactically and to stimulate growth. And so in my mind, those are not uses that should be allowed. Whereas individual treatment of sick animals, I think, should be allowed, and that's a very different issue. And Europe, it's been outlawed in Europe for a long time to use antibiotics that way, in that prophylactic way. So I don't think that that's happened at a national level, as far as I'm aware. That has not passed.
I'd seen it. Maybe it was a state level thing. And one of the things that you point out, because sick animals, I think historically there was a really big sort of epidemic of maybe a respiratory illness that wiped out like hundreds of millions of cattle in Europe or in Asia at one point. It was something that, I mean, it literally decimated the entire continent's population of cattle. And I think if they had some access to something to treat that, perhaps an antibiotic, it probably wouldn't have happened. Is that, am I remembering, did I make that up? I think I read that.
Well, there have been huge epidemics of various poultry diseases as well as swine. The last few major animal industry epidemics have all been in swine, actually. And there was, of course, the mad cow disease situation in Europe many years back now. So there have been, cattle diseases, but as far as I'm aware, the more recent epidemics have all been in poultry. But yeah, it's really, for me, the majority of those situations are about poor management, as far as, I mean, obviously there are always going to be diseases in animal agriculture. But I think the reason you're seeing more of these large scale epidemics is, again, because of these, large scale industrial kinds of facilities becoming more and more the norm, where you have animals that live in healthy conditions. Just like with humans, when we're living in healthy conditions, our immune systems can do most of the work and we rarely need to be medicated. And same with animals. If you give them a healthy environment, and optimally, all animals should be allowed to be outside and should be allowed to exercise, and just those two things alone will make a healthy animal most of the time. And then again, the genetics, if you're rearing them, if you're breeding them to make healthy, robust animals, they're going to be able to defend their own, their bodies will defend against most kinds of pathogens. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the animal industry to get better about that, to give animals more healthy conditions and to breed for healthfulness instead of just, like breast size. For example, in the, the chicken and the turkey industry, there's a lot of breeding for large breasts. I don't agree with those processes. I think that's the kind of stuff that need to be shifted. And there is some movement towards that. I don't know, Shawn, if you're familiar with Cook's Ventures. Matt Wadiak, he was one of the founders of Blue Apron. He started a company called Cook's Ventures, which is all about basically free range poultry. That he's created a big operation and he's using traditional chicken breeds. So he's got a slower growing chicken, but one that has, it's more normal body. It's a very healthy animal. And it doesn't really need any medications the vast majority of the time because it's a really healthy animal. And now as a meat eater, I can tell you I've eaten the chicken that he produces and it's incredibly delicious. It's like it's a better eating quality experience. And I don't know if he's measured the nutrients in it, but I think it's probably more nutrient rich as well. So that's the interesting thing about these issues. They're all connected. The flavorful, the flavor, the healthfulness, the environmental impact, the animal welfare, and they're all connected. And when we improve agricultural systems, we generally make all of those things better. And I think there's a lot of work to do in that regard, but that doesn't mean, you get rid of meat. In fact, I think, as I think meat is a really important food for humans.
Yeah, I just don't eat much chicken anymore. I just kind of lost the desire for it, so I haven't paid much attention to chicken stuff. But it's good to know some there are people that are doing that, because I do agree that it seems like some of these battery chicken operations where they're birth to slaughter, 5 weeks or something like that, does seem a little bit interestingly, in a perhaps a problematic way. But Let me ask you about, so there's been some recent legislation that has been, well, kind of proposed. I mean, Oregon and Colorado, Colorado had the Pause Act. In Oregon, they've got something, I can't remember what it's called, PS13 or something like that. But, there are people that are, these animal activists are trying to, continue to define, animal agriculture as sexual molestation and making it illegal, and trying to dictate slaughter ages to a degree that animal has to live its quote unquote natural lifespan, which if you let the cows out in the wild, they'd be eaten probably in a year anyway. I mean, it's we probably prolong their life longer than they would if they lived in nature, I think. But do you feel like there's been more pressure, real pressure, that it looks like they're going to try to end animal agriculture in any realistic way, or is this mostly just hype and just propaganda?
Yeah, well, I think I'm aware of these initiatives that you're talking about. And I think, I haven't looked deeply into what's motivating them and triggering them. But just, I've been working for literally over 20 years with animal activists. And sometimes I'm, working alongside them. And a lot of times I'm working kind of against what they're doing. And, and the way I'm working alongside them to clarify that is when, they're opposing practices that I don't think should be allowed in agriculture, so, such as like keeping veal continually in crates, for example. I don't think that's a humane practice. I don't think it should be allowed. And also sows, there's been legislation to outlaw keeping a sow in a crate continuously. And I actually think that's a very inappropriate practice. So I've supported the legislation that has outlawed that in many states. But I think what these initiatives are doing, my gut tells me, and based on lots of years of working, sort of mostly against what animal activists are doing, it tells me that this is another kind of way to grab public attention, and to get people talking about meat and the way animals are raised, in the hope that you'll get, some conversion, more people converting to the mindset that, meat is wrong, that we shouldn't be consuming it at all. They know that at this point in time, they don't have a prayer of passing any of these things. So to me, that's the only purpose that this could possibly be serving, is to try to get public attention to their issues. That doesn't mean that we should be just ignoring it. I think it's good that there's a pretty strong response coming out of the agricultural community and other quarters, because I think it's really important. One of the things I've noticed, in the 20 years I've been working on this stuff, is there's been a little bit of a shift of the way people talk about their own diets. And it used to be that, of course, you were, an omnivore, that was just assumed. And if you were a vegetarian or vegan, that was kind of unusual. And those people were almost kind of on the defensive. Not that I think that people shouldn't be, allowed to make that choice for themselves, but that was kind of there was like an assumption, a baseline assumption. And there's more and more of this kind of defensiveness that I think the omnivore is feeling, because there's more and more suggestion from all different quarters that you really shouldn't be eating very much meat, or if you're eating it at all, and maybe you shouldn't be eating it at all. And so people are almost feeling kind of like defensive. And a lot of the times, like when I'm giving talks to people who are, I give a lot of public talks, and a lot of times I'm talking to people in agriculture, and I've often encountered, I say to them, you don't have to be apologetic for your profession. And in fact, you're doing something you should be really proud of. And I give them all the reasons why, all of these, like methane, like we were talking about before, and other things are basically red herrings, and that it's really so much more about the how and not about the cow. That's the slogan that I think kind of sums up my whole work. And I'm just trying to make people feel remind people and make people fully understand that they don't need to feel in any way apologetic or embarrassed or ashamed for raising animals. And similarly, I don't think omnivores or people who are eating exclusively meat, need to feel in any way apologetic about their diet. And so that's a lot of what, I'm constantly trying to, make that argument again and again. But I think all of this stuff, this very, truly radical suggestions in these, state initiatives and stuff, is it's trying to make people feel ashamed to be eating meat. And I think those of us that believe in meat and for the human diet, we need to stand up very strongly and oppose those kinds of initiatives.
You know, one of the things that I've been a little disappointed in is like NCBA, beef checkoff, you know, the fact that, I mean, you know, in fact, to their credit, I mean, there's been some recent studies that have come out that they've helped fund that are very, very pro meat when it comes to health claims. And yet they're not making it in the national media. I don't see any attempt to advertise these studies. And I don't know, I mean, I understand that the USDA has been in the past sort of throttling the message. You know, you can't really say meat is superior or healthier or anything. You know, at the best you can say lean meat can be a part of a healthy diet, blah, blah, blah. That's a limitation of what you can do. You can't actually go out and say, you know, I make a claim that this acai berry from South America is some superfood. Look at all these antibiotics. But if I say something about beef, you can't, apparently they're not allowed to say this. And I'm just kind of disappointed because they have, you know, the beef checkoff. I mean, you know, as you know, every time a cow moves, they get $1. And there's a lot of cows. There's 95 head of cattle a million head of cattle in the United States. And so every time they're moving around, these guys are making $1. And so what's going on with the advocacy at the national level? And why are we not seeing massive media campaigns extolling the virtues of beef and the information about methane? And why do I have to search on my own to find this information? Why isn't it readily available? And you know, why isn't it there for every American or European or whoever wants to look at this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. And I argue in defending beef that I think the meat industry and the beef industry particularly has not been a good advocate at all for meat, you know, for its health benefits or refuting the environmental claims against it, or even, you know, sort of acknowledging the legitimacy of some of the concerns about environmental impacts and advocating for improving practices, you know, like, because my argument is never that everything's perfect. You know, I think there's a lot of improvement to be done, but that doesn't mean you throw the calf out with the bathwater. You know, you gotta look at honestly at, you know, criticisms and keep improving what you're doing as an industry. And I think that's how you keep, you know, that's how you keep public confidence in what you're doing. But I think part of the problem is that, I mean, I think 20 years ago, the big issue was simply that they didn't feel the need to defend, you know, to be sort of honest critics of themselves, because there was still so much acceptance of, you know, meat is fine, meat is healthy. But then as this has shifted, the public mindset has shifted, they haven't adapted very effectively at all. And I think what's happened in the last few years is really interesting. All of the major meat industries, or I shouldn't say maybe all, but many of the major meat companies have gotten heavily invested in faux meat, you know, or they're calling it alt meat, you know, alternative meat, they call it. And they even have new, you know, the meat industry trade publications. There's a whole new publication that's been out for the last year that's called, I think the title is alt meat. I actually get it. I receive it because I raise cattle. So I'm on their mailing list, and I'm always fascinated by what they have to say. But so rather than, you know, kind of defending meat vigorously, they don't want to do that because they're kind of like, oh, okay, there are other proteins that people might want to eat. Well, let's invest in that and it's all good. You know, it's really strange. So you have the industry itself, which should be the most vocal advocate for the importance and the value of what they're producing, but because they're economically, diversified now, and they're making faux meat patties on the side, and they think, well, this might be the future, so this might be our main source of revenue in the future, so we're not going to criticize that product at all, and defend, our product, our primary source of revenue right now. So it's a very interesting time right now. And I think, there's so much cynicism and skepticism out there in the world right now about information and what people are receiving and what to believe. And this is part of the reason why, you have, economic motivations that affects a lot of what information is shared or not shared. And I think this, the sad truth of the matter is the meat industry is a very poor advocate for itself. So we need to have, individuals like myself and you, kind of trying to dig through, sort through the studies and, share them widely as we can, so that people can see the credible science that's out there. And then, you know, everybody is kind of gathering information for themselves and making choices for themselves about their own diet, because we know that we definitely can't trust, you know, the USDA, my plate or food pyramid or whatever the thing is, because there's so much different things that are impacting, you know, how that comes out. And so people just basically, plus the more I've lived and the more I've read and more I've seen, the more I believe that individual dietary needs are quite different for people depending on their age, their gender, their ethnicity. You know, there's a lot of diversity in terms of what an individual probably is going to be the healthiest with. But none of that, you know, comes out in the, you know, in the USDA dietary guidelines. So I think, you know, there's a lot of complex reasons why we're not getting very good information from the government about what to eat. And the bottom line is it's not a very good source of information, unfortunately. You know, it should be, but it isn't.
Yeah, there's, you know, you back to the, you know, the meat industry, you know, you've got obviously the four major packers that kind of control something like 85% of the U.S. beef supply: Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef, which is owned by Marfrig, two of those being Brazilian companies. But so they've got investments in these plant protein alternatives, which are cheaper. And you know, you think about it, they've got lower cost of goods sold. They don't have to deal with the ranchers. You know, so it's in their interest to do that. And unfortunately, NCBA seems to represent the packers more so than the actual beef producers, the cattlemen. The U.S. Cattlemen's Association is probably a better group that actually represents the guys that are actually on the ground, you know, raising the animals. And so
Totally.
that's something that frustrates me as just a consumer. And I'm like, look, this is a good product. I understand it's a good health product, and you're going to, you know, be pushing this processed garbage on everybody, which is only going to make the situation no better and certainly potentially worse
Yeah,
from a health standpoint.
absolutely.
Nicolette, unfortunately, we're running out of time here, but I want to give you a minute to just kind of, if there's anything else you want to share, any other topics you think are important, and certainly let us know about your book. Can we buy meat from you? All those types of things. Where do we go to find out more information, so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, my husband is the founder of the Niman Ranch Meat Company, but we're not affiliated with that anymore. But that's a great source of really good quality meat. I just actually think people, you know, I assume that the vast majority of people who watch, you know, your videos are people who are already eating meat. And I just always think everybody can continue to improve everything that they're eating, you know, by seeking a better source, you know, and you might already be eating like the best possible foods. But like for me, I'm always, even to this day, after sort of being on this journey for more than, you know, 20 years, sort of trying to eat as well as possible, we can seek out, you know, really well-raised foods, whatever those foods are. And there's almost always stuff in your own local community that you can purchase, whether it's meat or greens or fruit, and directly from the farmer or rancher is usually the best way. Or, you know, at a farmer's market, through a CSA, you know, where you get a portion of the you know, the stuff that's produced, or farm stands. There are lots of good ways. I try to get as much food as possible directly from the source. Like even our fish, we're sort of fortunate. We live right in the ocean, and we actually barter with some people in the community who fish, and we give them some meat, they give us some fish, you know. So not, these aren't things everybody can do, and there's not like, you're probably never going to get 100% of your diet that way. But the more food you eat that's like directly from the source, you know, the person who's farming it or raising it or getting it, harvesting it, and also as close as possible to where you live, it's probably going to have the most amount of nutrition. And I'm sort of increasingly, you know, persuaded that that's kind of the key to good health. And I'm, especially over the long term. And I'm, you know, I'm always trying to do that with our, you know, our family. And I guess I would just say, as a sort of a closing comment, I really encourage people to do that. And, you know, sort of look for the things. They're not as easy. It's not as easy as going to the grocery store, but you know, go to the grocery store and get some things there for sure, like your pasta or whatever, if you're eating pasta. But that's not the place to get meat and vegetables and fruit if you possibly, and eggs are almost always easy to find from you know, someone who's raising them on pasture right in your community. That's almost always possible to find with a little bit of effort. And there's a lot more nutrition and a lot more flavor in that kind of food. So I just encourage people to kind of put the effort out and get the best possible sourced food that you can find.
One more thing I forgot to ask, and I'd be remiss not to do it. So you switched from a vegetarian to an omnivore, I assume. Do you notice an improvement in your health, or what's been your?
Well, the biggest difference for me has been that I noticed that I'm not hungry all the time. And I was, for 33 years, I was a vegetarian and I was really like hungry all the time. And I was, my weight was always quite good. My health was always good. I wasn't one of these people that had like some major health problem. And I haven't noticed a major health difference, but I noticed that I'm not hungry. And really interestingly too, I used to always crave sweets all the time. And I'm convinced that was, and I kind of even knew it at the time. That was part of the reason I was thinking about adding meat back into my diet, because I thought I could help address that issue. And it has had a big impact in terms of, like I was saying the other day, I was talking with Chris Kresser, and I was saying, I would be halfway through my lunch and I would already be thinking about what my lunch dessert was going to be, like that was what I was doing for 33 years. I don't do that anymore. I've noticed I'm way more satiated and I have far less cravings for, sweets or any kind of junk food, but especially sweets. And I definitely believe this has been a big shift for me. And I'm doing, I used to do weightlifting when I was younger and I stopped doing that for a long time, but I've been doing that again in the last year. And I haven't measured it. I should have probably been doing it, but I haven't measured it scientifically, like in terms of my, body mass index and all these other things, ways you can measure it. But just sort of anecdotally, I can tell that I'm able to build muscle really well and much more easily, I believe, than in the past when I wasn't eating meat. So I feel great. I'm really pleased that I'm eating meat now. And, for me, the big issue was passing the 50-year mark. And I just wanted to make sure that I was going into, kind of the second half of my life, giving my body everything I needed to be really healthy over the long term. And I didn't want to start, relying on a bunch of pills and, other sources of, nutrition. I wanted to have, based on my diet, be a really healthy, strong person. And I'm feeling really good. So I'm very happy that I made this shift. It's been about 2 years now almost that I've been eating meat, and I'm very happy that I made the decision to do so.
Well, Nicolette, thank you again. I appreciate it. Let's catch up again. Maybe it won't be 3 years in between next time, but good luck with the update to the book, and keep doing what you're doing. We need as many people as possible out there, spreading the message, because there's just a strong counter message we need to counter. So
yep.
Anyway, thank you, and thanks for coming here, and for us, you guys, thanks for being here. We'll see you guys back tomorrow. Otherwise, okay. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.